Chapter 34. A Ceremony of Innocence. John Wesley Weasel had instincts for the darkness and speed underground. When the black water flowed straight and downward, he swam the water. Where it boiled, he slithered rock, and down, breakneck. What harried him was the wind. The farther down he went below the earth, the louder grew a whistling premonitory wind, and the air in this tunnel was a sucking thing. It was a greater motion than he understood, like breathing. But down, because his rooster shouldn't die. What did the rooster think? Did rooster thinks nobodies would stand by him? Rooster gone in his lonesomeness, gone to do things alone? Fight worm, what the hell fight worm and planning already to die? Is no fight, a dying fight, is hopeless. So what a matter with rooster gone to die? John flung himself through the blackness, and down. When the tunnel suddenly opened, John Wesley bolted out onto a wide escarpment and tumbled. He rolled down stone until he hit an absolute floor with his left shoulder. The jolt shuddered his joints, and he was dizzy a moment. He had fallen into a measureless cavern. The wind fairly roared in this place, like a living thing, the haunting of the netherworld. John had no second thoughts about this wind. He feared it. He despised it. He was an animal who knew the malice of yellow tornadoes and sudden squalls in the afternoon. They were unnatural, but this was unnatural on purpose, alien altogether. "Rooster!" he cried. Far ahead of him was a sort of glowing, a livid shadow of astounding size. He blinked to see it, but it was vague. Therefore he threw himself across the stone, the better to see. He ran, and his poor heart kicked inside of him, because the shadow took shape, as huge as the razorbacks low in the mountains, and still, and longer than sight could follow, softly green, a head like a mesa, the mouth wide open, and maybe this blasting wind rushed from that mouth. Worm. John Wesley Weasel paused in awe. Worm, you are so big, and so wicked. The very stillness of the monster, in so violent a wind, was treachery. John Flat hated what he saw. But what he saw, like an endless bluff, it was not moving. It seemed a mere thrust of the landscape, a long green cliff that overhung him, impassive, calm, and dead. Dead. John Wesley choked on the wonder. "Rooster!" he cried. "Oh, Rooster, what you done? Dead. John wanted to laugh with his whole heart at the miracle. This was impossible. Who kills great worm, and single-handed? Dead! He stood on hind legs, leaning against the wind, and he pierced the roaring with his own triumphant cry, "Rooster!" Then all at once it seemed that the monster turned its eye, and John shrank from that horror. Too soon glad. Don't never be too soon glad. The horror went deep. John Wesley would not shake it until he'd left this place for good. Nor did it matter that there was no eye at all in the head of Worm, that it was a darker figure moving to look outward from the socket. The dread was in John now. The figure peered a moment into space, and then withdrew into the cavity and sat. It was Chanticleer. Chanticleer composed himself and sat, like being home. What? He likes it there? What? "Rooster! Ha-ha!" cried John Wesley, truly delighted. "What you done? Oh, so brave, the thing you done!" Again the cock inclined his head, but so casually. "But it's time now for critters to go," he called, truly fearful. "Come, Rooster! Buggers be so happy to hear the thing's all done. Come, we go!" Chanticleer said something. John Wesley could not hear him for the wind. "What?" he cried. The cock bent back his head and crowed. It was little in the rushing wind, but John heard it and was thunderstruck. "Save yourself, John!" crowed the rooster. "Go away!" "What? Rooster says what?" "Go away! Go away!" the rooster crowed in Worm's skull, blackness in his eye. "Leave me alone!" John Wesley was bewildered. and angry suddenly. "Why?" he cried. Like a lamentation, the rooster crowed, "I've found the bones of Mundokani. Here are the bones of Mundokani. I'll stay with the bones of Mundokani. Go." "Bones?" cried John. "What is bones? So Bones is buried, but soon comes some wickedness here, make some bones of us. Come and we go." "No." "Why?" "Because I'm going to die here." Oh, John hated the ceaseless blowing of the wind. The rooster said it. Said what they said he said. Said he's going to die here. No, rooster, he's not going to die here, and it never was a question, even, whether John should leave without him, because he loved his rooster. "No need," John announced. "No needs for dyings. Rooster, he can strut and be proud. Look-ye!" cried John Wesley. "Worm is dead." Then came a crow of shattering agony. "I did not kill him! He was dead! God took the glory from me! It is gone! It is gone!" The wind lulled as if a climax had been passed, and the silence that followed was a funeral. John's heart bled inside of him, because he loved his rooster. "Rooster," whispered John. "Oh, Rooster, he doesn't need to be Lord and General of all. No, not for John, no. Only just has to come home again, and might be rules a little bit. Please, just rule a little bit." But Chanticleer had bent his head. He was singing. In the silence, the weasel heard him singing softly to something in front of him. Bones. "Rooster?" Songs that rhymed with Mundokani, odd lullabies in this dank and cruel vault. "Rooster? Doesn't you talk with John no more? Rooster? Which somebody's still got fur on him? Does Bones or does John W?" Quivering melodies sung in the nose like an old, old woman. "Who loves you, Rooster?" The songs resolved themselves into a plain song chanting, no ending to them. But it never was a question whether John would leave this place without his rooster, and maybe the quiet was worse than the wind, and John was a weasel who could not act for long, and this had been too long, by gaw. "Hoopla!" he cried all suddenly. He took 10 steps toward the darkness, turned, and charged to the very jaw of Worm. "Hoopla!" Up the cheek of the monster he scrambled, screaming weaselish war cries. He gained the socket ledge and flung himself inside. Chanticleer had just begun to turn a bland eye toward him when the weasel, hoopla, threw him in a body check, grabbed the leg bone of Mundokani, yanked it free, and hurled it into the darkness. Tailbones went flying next, like dice skimming the stone. "Don't!" the rooster shrieked. Shin bones, ribs, a pelvis cavorted through the air. John cleaned house. "Wretch!" screamed Chanticleer. "What are you doing?" He sprang himself into the darkness. He sank out of sight, but a rattling below was the hectic rooster gathering bones again. "Mundokani! Mundokani!" he wailed. The wind began to blow, swelling like laughter. Finally, the weasel seized the skull itself and the dog's crumbling nose. He pushed it over the edge and leaped after it. So the rooster loves his bones, does he? So let him chase his bones. "Dog's head! Dog's head!" John Wesley sang, and he kicked it. "Here goes a dog's head!" He struck and punted the skull, like a ghastly ball. He drove it as fast as he could across the stone, and then he hooked a paw through an eye-hole and dragged it up the escarpment. John had an instinct for darkness. As though by feel, he found the tunnel again. There was bloody rage in the rooster's voice behind him. John didn't mind. He was behind him, after all. "Fire and fury, weasel!" cried the rooster. John didn't mind. He heard his rooster slam himself against the stone, trying to find the tunnel. John didn't mind that either. "Dog's head!" he sang, climbing against the current and pulling a hollow skull. "Dog's head!" 3 apparitions exploded from the hole. The animals were appalled by each and each. A skull came skidding out, grinning deathly. A weasel appeared, harassed and panting. He nearly collapsed to catch his breath, but a rooster leaped into the light and attacked him. The animals stumbled backward. Chanticleer swiped savagely at John Wesley, slashing his haunch. Gaff opened a long wound. The weasel did not defend himself. He took off running as best he could upstream, coloring the water with his blood. But the rooster was fixed on that beast. His comb was torn from his brow, his beak stove in, and someone thought he saw a tear in the cock's eye. It was no tear. It was a thread-like worm dangling from the tear duct. Chanticleer streaked to the neck of Black Pale and drove his weapons into flesh. "After him!" he commanded. The stag reacted to the pain. He lurched like an engine and bounded where the weasel went. The animals caught that intensity. Some crime had been committed. Some shivering excitement was in the air, and blood flowed in the water. They followed the rooster. This was no mindful choosing. He came and he left with a blistering passion. Passionately they jammed the canyon behind him, running, galloping, making of themselves a wild stampede. John Wesley both heard and felt the pursuit, for it troubled the bedrock. He was racing the ledge now, rounding bends and pumping his little legs like springs. His lungs were raging. His left hind leg was numb, but he dashed the canyon, John Wesley Weasel, some precious distance ahead of the herd. Oh, he had infuriated his rooster. He'd done that before, but never before had Chanticleer hacked him for it. Poor John Wesley. He didn't know what he'd done, but his rooster was up in daylight again. He'd done that. There was the canyon's end, but he was a broken weasel and could not climb giant steps. A dying weasel. At the last instant he cut right and dived into the coyote's den, sliding across the floor to the back, where he curled into a ball. 2 pups were knocked aside. Mama Coyote shied to the wall, away from him. Well, he was bleeding and looked filthy with combat. "Shh!" John Wesley put a paw to his mouth and made the only sound left to him, for he had no breath. Shaking his head, he warned them, "Shh! Shh!" But who had counted on the courage of Benoni Coyote, the great and innocent heart of that pup? "Double-do," he said. "You're cut," he said. He put his paw on the helpless weasel's shoulder. There was such sympathy in his manner. John Wesley gulped at the air. "Shh! Shh!" "It's the enemy," said Benoni. Furiously the weasel shook his head. He tried so hard to talk. But Benoni stood up, 4 square on his paws, his fur like a nimbus. He had a grave expression on his face. He knew this was no game. "Me too, Double-do," he said. "Mighty like my papa, a warrior like you." He turned and went out. His mama gasped. Then she blazed the den with a mother's cry, "Benoni!" And in a flash she was right behind him. With all his might, John dragged to the doorway, and then he had to hump his back to keep the other pups, bleating their fears, inside. But this is what he saw. He saw the careening charge of the animals, caught in a narrow strait, and who could stop them? He saw a mother snatch her child in desperate jaws, and a great black stag rise rampant above them, trying to stop. The furious rooster at his neck, and the driving weight of animals behind, how could he stop? The stampede poured past the stag. The first beasts twisted themselves aside, but the latter kept coming, and the mama was down below them all, saving her child by crawling toward the wall. But a hoof stunned her, and a hoof wounded her, and the continual passage of hooves beat her down, and one of them killed her. And this is what John Wesley saw. Benoni Coyote, caught in his mother's jaws, but he could not free himself however he wiggled, because she was dead. "Mama?" His mouth formed the word. "Mama?" The animals swirled in the narrow canyon, full of brutal confusions. The stag still reared above the mother and child. Chanticleer cut his spur into Black Pale's muscle. When the stag came down then, in the midst of the turmoil, his hoof hit something soft, and something snapped. Then Benoni rolled free of his mother and lay still, and her mouth was open, but his was closed, a bit of tongue protruding, and his eyes were closed. Benoni was dead as well. That is what John Wesley saw. The terrible bugling of the stag, finally, froze all the hearts in the canyon. Oh, Black Pale began to bugle a primitive grief. The animals drew away from him, and there they saw the murders, and then they understood. Soon they began a moaning too, but Black Pale's cry was inconsolable. Still bugling, he threw his body hard against the ice of the canyon wall, once, twice, 3 times, deadly blows, till the cock was shaken free and fell. Bugling still, Black Pale mounted the stones at the northern closure and bounded away. The animals followed. The rooster was left behind to pull himself from the stream. He stood, lost a moment. He looked at 2 bodies lying in a certain piece, and then, consciously, he did not look at them. He left. He took himself slowly downstream, the opposite of the others. All of this, with 2 babies behind him, now clutching each other in silence, is what John Wesley saw. He began to cry. Weasels can cry. And white and lightly as forgetfulness, touching torment like the wings of angels, it began to snow. Here ends the 3rd part of the Book of Our Sins. Oremus, illumina quaesumus Domine tenebras nostras. Part 4. Now the serpent was more subtle than any other beast. Chapter 35. The Snows. It was snowing now, in a steady, silent deadfall, filling all the little burrows of the earth, drifting mildly, blanketing everything with a kind of white amnesia. Maybe God said, "Let it snow." Maybe God had meant it mercifully. But for Pertinax Cobb, who lay in a foreign hole because he couldn't keep pace with the animals, but wouldn't go home without news, for Pertinax beneath the snow, it was oppressive, and he felt so lonely. The snow kept whiskering the ground above him, like some mammal sniffing the darkness. It sifted across a quiet earth, pretending to be light as ghosts, but that was a lie, because it was heavy after all, and made his hole a tiny pocket. He felt the drifts above him. He was a cob cut off. That would have been just fine if there had been 2 cobs together. Many a winter he and Mrs. Cobb had gnawed nuts in a chamber 5 feet below the cold, and he had told her stories, and half of them were fictions. But she would say, "You're wonderful, Mr. Cobb." So the fiction had had its truth. But Mrs. Cobb was nowhere near him now. He missed her, and the whispering snow made him miss her the more. Pertinax was homesick. Mrs. Cobb was a very important person. He knew that now. When it snowed at the hemlock, the hens and the mice woke up in wonder. They walked, grinning, onto the pillowed Liverbrook, making tracks and marveling at the cleanliness. They were very quiet a while. Oh, holy snow! Change itself was welcome in the Fimble winter. But then the brothers mice made miniature plows of themselves, and they raced around to scrawl some complicated designs in the whiteness. They squealed in perfect delight. So then other animals joined the fun, because what do you make of snow? You make fun. Down the Liverbrook slid some squirrels, and squirrels shook clots of snow from the trees. Sparrows played lancet games in the twigs. The dumpy partridge cried, "Dear me!" scandalized at herself for acting so silly. The fawn, de la Cour, tried to romp in a broad field of snow. Chalcedony the hen watched her, doubtful, and when the fawn went down in a white explosion, this hen was sure she had seen an injury. Children are so careless. But when the fawn clambered to her feet again, breathless with laughter, why, the crippled hen cackled till the tears ran from her eyes. Children are such a blessing. And this was the first time she had seen the child to laugh. Oh, the times they were improving. It snowed a gentle snow upon the earth, and Pertolote looked on in silence. She was grateful for the gladness of her sister, but she did not laugh. She was mourning Chanticleer. Pertinax felt a tremor. Instantly he was alert. He felt another and another, until he knew it for a steady rhythm. And then he was sure of his facts. Someone was coming. He punched his way to the surface of the world, popped out, and sat like a question on top of a drift. He looked north and gasped at the sight, for the valley had gone so lovely in the snow. It was a deep and dazzling bowl, an amphitheater all white and silent and old and old. "Whew!" said Pertinax at such grandeur. The snow had made eternity visible. But someone was coming. There was that thrumming through the ground. "Aye, there! See! News!" At the northern rim of the valley a beast appeared, as black as a midnight memory. It sailed the lip and then descended the long fells, bounding beautifully, kicking white clouds behind it. Pertinax ran a step sideward, and then stopped to watch, ran for excitement, then watched again. News! Marvelous speed in that creature, majesty, and a marvelous large head. No, 'twas a great rack of antlers on him, laid back because his face was raised. Ah, yes, a deer! Pertinax stood, severe, and squealed inside his chest. The animals were coming home again. Cobb, the ground squirrel of hyper-curiosities, he'd get to hear it first of all, and then what? Then he'd tell it to Mrs. Cobb. That's what. That deer, that messenger, never slacked, but bounded 20 feet a leap, his forelegs knifing softer snow, his hind like pistons whirling snow into the air. Pertinax couldn't stand it. He cried out, "Bring us the news!" and he ran to stand directly in the deer's path. So up the near side of the valley lunged the deer, and Pertinax saw mucus streaking a black flank, and blood on the shoulder, and Pertinax heard the woof that came with every landing, and Pertinax knew his name. "Black pale on a silver field!" he cried. "Stop! Tell me the—" But the stag did not stop, did not even hear the cry. The stag burst by him, destroying the world in blizzard and blindness, thunder booms beside him, and Cobb went tumbling backward. But Cobb caught sight, through the cloud, of Black Pale's eye, and Cobb grew cold. He stared at the stags retreating until the woods had hidden him and the crystal cloud had sunk again. He stared till the land was quiet. There was a memory nagging his mind. "His eye," said Pertinax. It was like—" Once in a drought the squirrel had gone down a narrow shaft which should have ended in a reservoir of water, but the bottom was dusty, hollow, and dry, and the squirrel despaired. "The eye of that deer is an empty well," said Pertinax, and he said, "The news isn't good news, is it?" This is the way that it was in the south. The snow fell fine and beautiful, with a soundless flake. There was the sense of mothering come to a drowsy child, someone tucking the world to sleep. Animals were thankful for the feather bed. But in the north, those several nights, the snow was a dissatisfied hag, bitch winter, beating the earth with her stick. Bitter crystals blew hard and horizontal so that the animals lowered their heads and turned away. If someone tried to see where he was, his eyeballs stung for the trouble, as though punished for looking, and he saw nothing anyway. So the sheep simply stopped on a hillside, the lee side, they hoped, but they didn't know. They were leaderless, and their own poor senses had been whited out. They pressed together in a flock, all of them hanging their heads, not one of them lying down for fear that he might be covered and smothered and lost forever. Or maybe sheep were just too stunned to think of lying down. They'd walked into this weather standing up, they'd wait the weather standing up still. They stood, leaderless. They stood like plain cattle in the blizzard. They packed their tails against their anuses and stood motionless. And this is how submissive the sheep were. They didn't so much as shake the hoarfrost from their faces. Their own breathing bearded them. Their exhalations froze, and the white beards grew because no one told them to move. It's a perilous thing to be leaderless and obedient at once. When there's no command to obey, then no becomes the only command, and it's a heartless one. No to instincts, No to boldness, no to newness, even in this witching weather, and then no to survival, and no to life. Don't move. How do you know your movement isn't for the worse? Then stand still and hang your heads, sheep, sheep. And the harder the storm blows, the meeker the sheep. The worse the conditions, the more they yearn to obey. Therefore this blizzard fixed them. Leaderless, there was nothing to do but nothing. Leaderless, they just stood still, and the hag shrieked all around them, cursing them, beating them with her stick. Leaderless, sheep are lost. There was one creature untroubled by the blizzard and the extremities of the north. Boreas, the white wolf, had an eye as cold and pale as the ice, and a paw so wide it walked the drifts, thick shank fur, a powerful neck, and a heart impervious to hostilities or friendship, either one. Boreas trod snow as if he were the snow, carelessly, and he moved of a perfectly free will through any wind of the winter. Boreas stood on a high ridge, watching the dispersion of the animals. If he helped none of them, it wasn't because he wished them ill, simply he had another purpose on his mind, and nothing disturbed his purposes. He was interested in the state of one being only. Let the others pass. Now Notos, the black wolf, came slinking behind him in spiteful misery. He blew on his knuckles. He hated the knifing wind. "Let's go," he growled. "Didn't you see it?" Boreas asked, not so much as flicking his eye. Eurus and Favonius and the grey Chinook stepped closer. Notos swore an oath. "I can't see nothing. I don't care for nothing. I'm freezing to death, damn it. I saw a weakness." The white wolf heard what he wished to hear. Presently he was deaf to complaints. Chinook said, "I saw it too. Let it be." No, Boreas mused slowly. There's a crack in the rooster. There's a flaw somewhere. Him, his mind, his rule, his authority. I wonder. I don't know. I wonder. He swung his head round to look at Chinook. They were shadows in the unobstructed wind, their fur in whorls, but their frames stood firm. "And how deep does it go, I wonder?" said Boreas. Notos, finally, spat a filthy word at the both of them, and started off in the blizzard. Boreas finished his thought first, saying, "The times are changing. Count on it." Then he raised his eyes after Notos. "He thinks he's going south," he said. Eurus and Favonius shrugged. "He isn't," they said. "Well, go with him then," said Boreas, "the four of you. Take your way to the rooster's land again, and watch for the flaw. I'll watch for it here." Boreas lingered alone on the ridge thereafter, allowing the wind its ripping of his coat. He didn't move. He wanted to assess the rooster. He wondered, coolly, what the possibilities. At the dying of the blizzard and the bare beginning of dusky light, String Jack grew bold. He put his face out of the snow and looked around. Then, slowly, since all the world had changed, he crept forward on a blue sculptured land. He hopped carefully across the crusty snow, feeling estranged and endangered. This was a world too smooth to be true, its valleys and hills ceramic, and the silence too mystic. He didn't know where to go. He'd lost his bearings. String Jack had passed the storm in a personal hole, as had all of his kin, here, there, and everywhere, and now he went looking for them, with greater and greater panic, because he could not find them. The world had changed, and the family was scattered. Smells were gone, so he felt as though his nose itself was gone. His stretching ears heard nothing. And what did his eyes see? A stark and lifeless land. No, it was worse than that. He saw statues. He saw on a hillside statues of the most unnatural sort of creature. They stood 5-legged, the 5th leg where the head should be, and no head at all. And there was not just one of this mutant breed. There was a whole herd, frozen, Timeless! String Jack's ears popped up like exclamation points, indeed. Then he cancelled them straight away, afraid that they'd been seen. And then he cancelled himself, in a high-speed decision to quit this museum, with his relatives or without them. The world had changed. How could a hare understand what he couldn't name, or approach what he'd never seen before? All he could do was escape. All he could do was be afraid. All he could be was afraid. And all had to be handled alone, for strangeness and fears divide the closest of kin. Of course not. These were no abnormal beings that the hare had seen. They were sheep, mere sheep, but the frost on their faces had frozen like stumps of ice to the ground, and they were every one imprisoned in their low servility, bowing down with no other choice left to them. Their heads had turned to legs, or so it seemed at a distance. The storm was over, and still the poor sheep stood. They could neither lie down nor walk, though in this more peaceful weather they might have chosen either to rest or to go home. Ice-locked, slave-locked to nothing. Lord Chanticleer had brought them north, but Lord Chanticleer was not taking them home again. The sheep were abandoned to the tendencies of their own natures, but sheep under sheep are under no one, and freedom for them becomes captivity. They didn't even bleat. They stood on 5 legs and waited, bowed down. In the same dim morning light, Boreas saw him. From the ridge the wolf looked down upon the singular cock, Lord Chanticleer, passing southward all alone. Alone the rooster went, but not at ease. He was dragging something after him with a great deal of effort. It didn't slide well, whatever it was, and the snow impeded it. It moved by yanking or by pushing, and often the rooster swept it clean with his wing. Suddenly, while the white wolf watched him, Chanticleer jerked erect. He issued a short cry, immediately cut off. Then he doubled down and coughed. He thrust his head forward, coughing violently as though strangled. His wings thrashed the snow on either side, till a final retching spewed up an enormous gorge. Chanticleer crowed and attacked that gorge, moving with such force and clean direction that Boreas shook his head. "No, not yet," he whispered. "Not weak enough yet." Below, the rooster stood still a moment, by habit ruffling his feathers after a fight. He sighed and returned to the cargo, his sledge, and push by push drove it southward ahead of him. Boreas slipped the ridge then and descended to identify the rooster's adversary. Worms. They were worms, 20 worms as thin as thread, each one cut precisely in the middle, a single dark drop of blood for each, and the blood, though dark, it was not red. Boreas lifted his head to gaze where the rooster went. He heard the coughing again, and then distantly the cry. He said, "The times are changing."